The United States has the largest nominal GDP of any nation at $27.72 trillion as of 2025. But one concern is the national debt, which is now nearly $37 trillion, and the debt to GDP ratio is 124% and rising. Is it possible that the United States can go bankrupt? The US wasn't always a nation of debt. Only 200 years ago, the debt was $83 million, and 10 years later, President Andrew Jackson paid off the debt, the only president ever to achieve this, with vetoing spending bills, selling government land, and opposing the recharter of the Second Bank of the United States. However, his policies contributed to the Panic of 1837, a major economic depression that followed his presidency. This depression brought back debt, and it increased again. A large spike occurred during and after the Civil War, when the debt hit $2.7 billion by 1865. In the early 1920s, the Harding and Coolidge administrations reduced the debt from $26 billion to $16 billion thanks to economic growth and spending restraints. But by the 1930s, in the midst of the Great Depression, government spending dramatically increased. During World War II, the national debt skyrocketed to $270 billion, and the debt to GDP ratio reached 120%, the highest ever at the time. The 1950s saw expansive economic growth, and while the debt increased, the GDP increased faster, leading to a rapidly lowering debt to GDP ratio, only 30% by 1981. Yet, it started once again to increase through the 1980s. Thanks to lingering inflation from the 1970s and early 1980s, due to President Reagan's tax cuts, especially on the wealthy, and from increased military spending. After the Cold War ended, a period of peace ensued, and bipartisan cooperation between President Bill Clinton and Congress created a budget surplus, and a reversal of the debt by the late 1990s, allowing the debt to GDP ratio to decrease to 53% in May of 2001. Then, 4 months later, the 9/11 terrorist attacks resulted in the invasion of Afghanistan in October, and indirectly was connected to the Iraq invasion in 2003. Those, coupled with the Bush tax cuts, increased the debt and the debt to GDP ratio. But things started to become very troublesome in 2008, when the Great Recession led to the collapse of part of the US banking industry. The GDP went down, and spending due to bailouts, unemployment payouts, and infrastructure spending increased the debt to GDP ratio to 100% by 2012. While debt continued to increase during the 2010s, the ratio remained relatively stable until 2020, when the next crisis hit, the COVID-19 pandemic. In March of 2020, the world pretty much shut down, and this led to an artificially induced global recession, decreasing the US GDP, substantially raising unemployment rates, and causing many businesses to shutter, temporarily or permanently. To respond to this, the first Trump administration gave out trillions of dollars to Americans, including stimulus checks, unemployment benefits, and PPP loans to businesses. And this resulted with the highest ever debt to GDP ratio of 131% in June of 2020. Since then, things have stabilized thanks to the economy recovering, and this has increased the GDP and slightly lowered the debt to GDP ratio. However, all is not well, and the United States may be headed towards troublesome times, especially decades down the road. Just recently, the US lost its last perfect credit rating when Moody's downgraded it to AA1, the second highest. This is not really of a concern in the short term, as the US is still ranked very highly and better than other economic powerhouses like France, the United Kingdom, and Japan. However, if government spending continues to increase at a faster pace than the GDP, the debt to GDP ratio will further increase. What are the factors that are increasing the debt? Well, there are many. In 2024, the US government brought in $4.92 trillion, but spent $6.75 trillion, resulting in a $1.83 trillion deficit. Nearly 75% of the budget went towards Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, SNAP, unemployment, and veteran spending, all that are deemed as mandatory. Demographically, the United States is aging, and the largest generation, baby boomers, are becoming senior citizens. In fact, by 2029, all baby boomers will be seniors, and they will be collecting Social Security and Medicare. And it's likely that spending for these programs will increase. These programs are also havens for fraud, and it's estimated that it accounts for between $85 to $100 billion a year in illegal activities. Defense spending accounts for around 13% of the budget and nearly $900 billion, while all other government departments and services account for another 12%. When President Trump started his second term in January, DOGE was created, with the help of billionaire Elon Musk. The goal of this department was to end wasteful spending within the federal government by going after departments and programs deemed not mandatory. So far, it claims to have saved $175 billion. This number is substantial, but in reality, it puts an extremely small dent into reversing the debt. Now, President Trump wants to pass the One Big Beautiful Bill, which would enact sweeping tax cuts and significant funding for defense and border security, offset by deep cuts of Medicaid, SNAP, green energy, and EV perks. Analysts say it will add $2.5 trillion to the national debt over 10 years, and Musk has voiced his dislike of it, which has caused a nasty falling out between him and Trump. Nevertheless, if this bill is passed, it will do nothing to save money. In fact, both Democrats and Republicans have done little to deal with the national debt, as both parties historically added to it. How can the United States tame its debt? It's very difficult at this stage, but with governmental cooperation, it can be done. Taxes are what bring in revenue, but not enough of that is being generated thanks to tax loopholes, tax cuts, and fraud. During the 1950s, the top tax rate was 91%, but thanks to more loopholes than there are today, few paid that. Now, it's 37%, with a 3.8% surtax totaling 41%. Yet, there are many loopholes, and few still pay the top rate, which in turn doesn't generate revenue for the federal government. So instead of changing the tax rate, loopholes and deductions should be eliminated. Tax fraud is another major issue in the United States, and fraudsters should be tracked down and prosecuted harshly so that it will deter others who may want to partake in it. In the last few decades, American workers have been contributing more of their salaries to Social Security and Medicare, and this unfortunately needs to continue. In addition, considering that people are living longer, a retirement age increase may be needed to lessen the burden on retirement programs. Related to Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid is fraud within that, associated with fake healthcare claims by medical professionals and collecting of disability benefits not really needed by an individual. This fraud dramatically increases the price of healthcare for Americans and takes away from people who actually need disability benefits. Defense spending is increasing every year and may eventually approach $1 trillion soon. To counter this, the United States should create a more technologically advanced streamlined military. This would lessen the budget substantially while allocating money for actual defense purposes. Externally, foreign military aid to other nations needs to be decreased. Between the Afghan war on terror and the Iraq war, it cost the US $6 trillion. While the US remains a global superpower, it just doesn't have the money to pay for other nations' geopolitical problems. Yet, it's still funding conflicts. The two largest receivers of military aid in 2024 were Ukraine and Israel, two nations currently at war with Russia and Hamas. Throughout the 21st century, the US national debt is projected to go higher. By 2029, projections show that the US will have a national debt between $43 to $46 trillion and a debt to GDP ratio in the 130s. Although a ratio that high is concerning, the US is a reserve currency nation, as the US dollar is widely accepted and used in international trading and finance. Also, the US borrows its own money, and not other nations. and it has a very diversified and resilient economy which keeps growing every year. So, it's highly unlikely that the United States will go bankrupt, but it could face economic instability or long-term erosion of fiscal strength if debt continues to grow unchecked without reforms. Right now, Washington politicians should work together and focus on effective strategies that will tame the rising debt. The best scenario would be that the debt-to-GDP ratio will drop below 100%. This will ensure that the United States remains a global economic superpower. Do you think that the United States can ever go bankrupt? I'd love to hear your feedback, so please leave your opinion in the comment section below. That concludes this week's episode. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you like learning about the world, you found the right channel. So be sure to subscribe to my channel, Urban to Earth, to view more videos. Until next time.